Welcome to Rosie the Reviewer. We're your hosts. I'm Sam,
And I'm Marcia.
and we like World War II media, and we want to talk about it. Welcome back to Rosie the Reviewer. This week we're talking about a film called Hart's War that came out in 2002. It was directed by Gregory Hoblit and written by Billy Ray and Terry George. It's based on a novel of the same name by John Katzenbach, which came out in 1999. And it is a mostly fictional story about a racially motivated court-martial taking place inside a POW camp during World War II. What did you think of this movie?
Really enjoyed this movie. I watched it earlier this week and I was really invested from start to finish. So that's good. It's got Colin Farrell in it, who's great. I really enjoy him. It's also got Bruce Willis, and he's Bruce Willis, so he's cool. And then it's also got, what's his name?
Howard.
Terrence Howard, who's also enjoyable, and it's got Tuskegee Airman in it, so it's got a load of things that I like. But it's kind of a war movie meets law drama. I wouldn't necessarily call it your typical war movie. But that made it interesting for me. I would like to say this was also again recommended to us by Ben. So Ben, thanks for recommending that. That was fun. What did you think of the movie?
Yeah, I mean, I read the book first, so that always spells trouble for any film. Well, I shouldn't say always. Bridge on the River Kwai, looking at you. But yeah, I found that while I was reading the novel, that there were definitely points where I thought it could have maybe used an editor to make it a little tighter. And I didn't think the dialogue was great. Like, I don't think that's perhaps the author's greatest strength, but it was a really suspenseful novel that I enjoyed reading. And there was a lot of complexities and nuance in the plot that were just totally dropped in the adaptation to make it to a film. And obviously, I understand often why changes are made to streamline a story and to make it make more sense for a viewing audience. But they made some changes that I wasn't sure why they made them. And I thought that the book has a lot of strong themes around. I mean, first of all, the entire book takes place in this claustrophobically small world of the POW camp. The main character has been there for years. His whole kind of world has narrowed to this POW camp, and the movie starts outside of the POW camp. And so it's really kind of expanded this world that the characters live in. And yeah, and this idea of just trying to find ways to pass the time in the camp and these relationships with people you're in forced proximity with that you might not necessarily be friends with out in the real world, and trying to find a way to eke out an existence. And also quite strong themes of this idea of Hart's War being a war against racism. And I found in the movie they kind of diluted that and they made it more of a thing about more broadly, I guess, honor and integrity among soldiers kind of thing, especially the Colin Farrell character arc. I mean, I did read a little segment where the author of the novel was talking about how he was a little disappointed in the changes that were made and some of the more complex subplots that were dropped or altered. The novel was based on his father's experiences, based on conversations he'd had with his father, and his father was also a little disappointed with sort of the way they presented the historical situation at the time. And so yeah, I didn't hate my watching experience when I was watching the movie. I thought Colin Farrell was really solid. Bruce Willis is just doing Bruce Willis, but I guess that's what you hire him to do if you're hiring him to be in a war drama. And yeah, it was pretty well paced, but as an adaptation to the book, I think I was a little disappointed.
Yeah, I can see that. I do wonder if you'd not read the book, I think you would have enjoyed it more.
Yeah, that's often the case.
Anyway, let's get into the movie. The movie, unlike the book, opens in Belgium on December 16, 1944. We meet First Lieutenant Thomas Hart, played by Colin Farrell, as he is captured by German commandos during the Battle of the Bulge. I don't think we see this in other movies, but we have talked about this before, where he's trying to get to Sandvie, I think, and there's a sign on the path that he's on, and they're stopped by American soldiers, and I think a military police, and they're telling him to go the other way, but they turn out to be Germans pretending to be Americans. This actually happened a lot during the Battle of the Bulge, where they would just try and lure Americans into ambushes, which is what happens here. He gets picked up and tortured, and He's pressured to give up intelligence to his German interrogator, and he's naked.
Yep. He sure is. In the Belgian winter, so probably not super enjoyable. Yeah, this is the first marked change from the book. When I was watching it in the very first scene, I was like, "Oh, this is interesting," because in the book, Hart is a navigator in a bomber crew who gets shot down over the Mediterranean, and he gets rescued from the water, and he's the only surviving member of his crew. So he has all these memories of his crew coming back to him throughout the book, and he feels really guilty as the only survivor. And in the film, they have him during this interrogation betray the location of some fuel dumps, which replaces his survivor's guilt with this guilt about something that he actually did. And also in the book, Hart has been at the camp for a long time. He's been there since 1942, I think. And so he's kind of an old timer. And he knows the ins and outs of the camp, but he still finds himself an outsider. He doesn't really have strong relationships with the men in the camp, and he's just kind of trying to get by until the day that he can get out.
Yeah, I don't like. I guess I can say this now, knowing that they've changed this from the book, but I don't like that they've made him into this officer who's not. Like, he's been at Company HQ. He's not been in battle, per se. Like, he's very green. And he's this. I think he's got this general father, and, like, they make him out to be this kid who doesn't know what honor is. And obviously, being in a bomber crew, that would not be the case, so I don't like that change very much.
Yeah, and that was one of the changes that they made where I was like, "Why have you done this?" But I mean, I'm not a screenwriter, so, you know.
It almost makes me wonder, we've talked a little bit about this before we started recording, but I read that they acquired the movie rights before the book was finished. I almost wonder if they started working on the screenplay before they read the entirety of the book. But it's such a major change, I don't understand.
Yeah, it's pretty fundamental, and you know right away in the book how he got into the POW camp, and it just changes the whole context of his character arc, I think.
It does, and it also puts it later in the war, I guess, if he's only getting to the camp in 1944, but he's been in the camp for 2 years in the book. That's a long time to be there.
Yeah, definitely.
And it also makes his outsider feeling more interesting if he's actually been in the camp for a long time. Like, why do you still feel like an outsider? That makes him for a more complex character than having just arrived.
Yeah. No, definitely, for sure. And it makes more sense that McNamara, who we'll meet soon in the movie, but he's the ranking American officer in the POW camp for the uninitiated. That's basically how it works. The Germans would allow the ranking American officer to be in charge of his own men effectively. So it makes more sense if Tommy's been in the camp for a long time that McNamara knows that he has a legal background and knows that he probably has the correct political beliefs maybe to defend a Black American in a trial.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so back to the movie. Hart and many other Americans are transferred by train to a prisoner of war camp. And while they're en route, a flight of P-51 Mustangs attacks the station, which is supposedly something very similar to what happened to the author's father during the war. So this scene does not appear in the book, but based on what I read about the author, this is something that his father told him had actually happened. And since the painted letters POW on top of the train are covered by thick snow, the Mustangs don't realize that they're firing on their own guys effectively. So to save themselves, the POWs manage to get out of the train and they spell POW with their bodies, and this prevents further strafing. But they end up being recaptured by the Germans and taken to a POW camp, in this case, the fictional Stalag 6A.
Yeah, I didn't hate the scene, and one of the Americans that you kind of see in the beginning, that's not Tommy Hart, he dies immediately, and I thought, usually I don't know these people, I don't care, but I did care about this one for some reason, so they do a good enough job at making you feel stuff.
It was Adrien Grenier. I recognized him immediately, and I was like, "Oh no, Adrien Grenier, fridged immediately."
Maybe that's why, maybe it's because I recognize the actor. I don't know what I recognize him from, though.
He was in Entourage.
Oh, right, that makes sense.
Prior to the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans held captive twice as many US airmen as ground troops, which makes sense. There was a period during the war, I think in 1943, where airmen would be falling and getting captured at a rate of like 400 a month. But this situation reversed after the battle because nearly 23,000 American ground troops were captured. So that's kind of what we're seeing in this movie here.
I'm also trying now to remember from the movie. Everyone at the POW camp has to be ground troops, right? Because they were, at least if it was accurate, they would have been sorted by, like, Air Force, Army, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and actually, you're right. So it makes little sense that the pilot, Lincoln Scott, is in the same camp as Tommy Hart, who was infantry. But you know what? I didn't even notice that, but you're right.
So weird. As he arrives to the camp, Hart is debriefed by the ranking American officer, Colonel William McNamara, played by Bruce Willis, and he kind of grills him. He seems to be friendly, but then he asks him if he cooperated with the Germans after he was captured, and Hart says he hasn't. But then McNamara sends him to a bunk in a barracks for the enlisted men instead of with the other officers, even though there's an empty bunk in the officers' barracks where he should have been staying. So you're like, wait, he doesn't believe him, you just know immediately. And we also meet Staff Sergeant Vic W. Bedford, played by Cole Hauser, and he seems to be friendly at first, and he scratches up a new pair of boots for Hart, who has lost his boots while being tortured naked.
Yeah, they do a good job with this character, and I think it's the same in the book where he's someone who's pretty friendly to Hart, who seems to have quite a few friends in the camp. Who's this guy who kind of wheels and deals and scrounges and is able to get things that you need for you. So he kind of has these relationships with everybody. There's a moment that we see in the film, which also takes place in the novel, where they see the Russians in the other camp are not being fed. And essentially, that was true to real life. What would happen is that the Germans and the Americans would treat each other's POWs reasonably well. Not great, but they were by and large following the Geneva Conventions, whereas the Germans and the Russians did no such thing with each other's POWs. And so we see the Russian POWs, they're starving on their side of the wire. And so this character, Vic, he kind of steals some bread from the Germans and he's throwing it over the wire to the Russians, prevent them from starving. And so, this is obviously a guy who is able to build relationships with people. In some ways, his heart is in the right place. But then we see later that he's also a virulent racist. And in the book, they get into this a bit more where he has this whole discussion with Hart where he's like, I'm not prejudiced. I know black people. That's not the word he uses, but you know what I mean. He's like, I just know what they're like, but I'm not prejudiced. And so he's kind of a complex character. I thought they did a really good job of presenting this guy who, on the surface, seems like he might be a decent dude, but then underneath, maybe not so much.
When disregarding the racism, does he remind you of any other character we might have talked about in another episode we did about another movie set in a POW camp?
Don't remember.
The guy in Stalag 17, I think. Is it Stalag 17 or is it The Great Escape? I always forget. There's a traitor in the midst.
Yeah, it's Stalag 17.
So go listen to that one.
2 Tuskegee Airmen are brought into the camp. They are Second Lieutenants Lincoln A. Scott, played by Terrence Howard, and Lamar T. Archer, played by Vichelis Shannon. Bedford is a huge racist douchebag to them, and McNamara assigns them to Hart's cabin. Again, these are officers. They should be placed in officers' quarters, but they're being assigned to this enlisted man's cabin. And McNamara is basically like, Hart, you maintain order in there, which, goes about as well as you might expect with the camp's biggest racist sharing a cabin with the camp's 2 black airmen. Anyway, yeah, so the Tuskegees have a terrible time, and the enlisted men basically disrespect their rank and call them racial slurs to their faces.
Hart does stick up for them immediately, which I thought you can see immediately what they're trying to do with Hart. Like they're trying to make him more sympathetic, which I think is fine. But I don't know. He's also they're both these outsiders, right? Like, but for very different reasons.
Yeah, definitely. And I think in the book we get more of Lincoln Scott getting to articulate to Hart why they are different and how there are things about his situation that Hart will never be able to understand. And that as much as Hart tells him, you have to try and keep your cool, Scott very much gets to, I guess, articulate a little bit more what his situation is like. And yeah, I mean, I did think Terrence Howard did a good job in the movie. I would have maybe liked to see his character get fleshed out a little bit more and have it be less about the character arc of, like, the nearest white guy.
Yep. I can agree with you there. I think he's great. We did an episode about Red Tails, and I think he might be in it, or he might be in the other Tuskegee Airman movie, which is called the Tuskegee Airman, which I watched while we also watched Red Tails. But go listen to that episode if you want to learn more about the Tuskegees, because you should. So, as everybody settles in, a P-51 strafes the camp and sets fire to the theater, leaving it partially destroyed. McNamara then goes around and has a little nosy in the, like, partially destroyed building, which is important for later. And I like that we get a little mention of the rat tails in this specifically.
I feel like this movie made an attempt to question the basic tenets of the Americans thinking that they were the forces on the side of freedom and democracy versus the Germans who were not. There's a part where the Americans are talking about the Russians and the Germans being like, well, they're subhuman. And the Americans being like, well, we don't make that distinction, those kinds of distinctions. And the SS officer is like, oh, you don't make those kinds of distinctions? Like very clearly referring to Black Americans. But I don't think it goes far enough. I think they wanted too badly to make McNamara a quote unquote good guy. And they just didn't allow him to be the kind of person who would have existed during World War II, these people who really had cognitive dissonance around the treatment of Black Americans.
I also want to bring up something else that I haven't put in the notes for this, but it just kind of. Did you think, or am I alone in this, that the SS officer is a little bit too nice and decent?
The interesting thing is that in the book, there's a camp commandant. So in the book, obviously, it's a Luftwaffe camp, and they have a camp commandant who is your classic old school Luftwaffe officer who we kind of talked about in our Great Escape episode. These kind of guys who believed in the honor of the air war, who were like, well, the Americans are treating our airmen decently, so we're going to treat their airmen decently, and we're going to behave with honor, and we don't want the Gestapo to come in here and run the camp. And so that character exists in the book. And the character of Visser, who is our main Nazi, I suppose, in the movie, he's kind of like a separate guy who comes into the camp. And we find out later that he comes from the Gestapo to solve this murder that's happened, which we haven't spoken about yet. Yeah, so he is, in the book, he's definitely the slimy SS guy, and then there's sort of this archetype of the more honorable German, and I feel like they just tried to smash those two characters together in the movie. A spike from their fence, which could be used as a weapon because it's sharp, is found in Archer's bunk. The Germans basically come in and do a search, and they immediately check his bunk, so it's very clear that someone tipped them off that it was there. And it's obviously a setup. We know that Bedford probably put it there. The Germans drag Archer out and just execute him, claiming that he was trying to escape. And directly after that, in a suspicious coincidence, a radio used by the Americans to receive coded messages via the BBC is found and destroyed.
Yeah, it's like, this is so obvious that something is not right here.
Yeah. Another interesting change from the book is that Archer doesn't exist. The only black flyer in the camp is Lincoln Scott, and he's kind of isolated in part, of course, because all of these white airmen are suspicious of him, but also he goes out of his way to isolate himself. And so they all think he's a bit suspicious because he doesn't share food with them, for example, and he keeps to himself and he kind of walks the perimeter of the camp and doesn't try and participate in their activities. Now, whether or not he would be welcome to do that is another matter, I guess, but the airmen kind of think that he's a bit aloof and standoffish, and so that kind of isolates him in another way. The conflict between Scott and Bedford really gets kicked up a notch because all of the guys are playing baseball, and there's a similar scene to this in the movie, but they don't really draw it out the way they do in the book, and this ball bounces past what they call the deadline. So there's this wire that runs along the inside of the fence, and if any of the airmen cross the wire, then they'll be shot by the Germans in the tower, unless they put on this like special white smock that has like a big red X on it, and then they're allowed to cross the deadline just to like pick up a ball, for example, if it goes over. But Lincoln Scott's new at the camp, so he doesn't know about the smock. And Bedford is like, oh, why don't you go grab that ball for us on the other side of the deadline? And Lincoln Scott is just about to step over the line, and Tommy Hart is like, wait, 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 wait. You got to put the smock on. And so by doing that, he saves Scott's life, and Scott immediately realizes that Bedford thought it would be funny to try and get him shot by the Germans.
I don't even remember how that scene ends in the movie because I do remember the ball going over the line, but I don't recall what happens next.
It basically just transitions immediately into something else, like, Scott doesn't even really acknowledge him saying it.
So weird. Why did it not just finish that scene?
I don't know, man.
Soon after, Bedford is himself found dead. We watch this kind of through the perspective of Hart, who sees something happen in the dark, but not much. And there's been some eyewitnesses that say that they've seen Scott standing over the body, and Scott is immediately accused of killing Bedford in revenge for him framing Archer. So it doesn't look very good. And we learn that Hart was a law student at Yale before the war, and he's appointed by McNamara to defend Scott at his court martial, which the camp commandant, Oberst Werner Visser, played by Marcel Yuri, agrees to. So, this is not the first time we see this camp commander, obviously, but it's the time I chose to introduce him. Not a very good time, I will admit.
Yeah, and I think this is another place where we lose some little things from the book. So, by having this character come into the camp at the point of the murder and to have him be separate from the camp commandant, this is one of the things that tips Tommy off in the book that there's something more to the killing than just revenge. Because he's like, why does the Gestapo care who killed this guy? Like, why is this a matter for the secret police? Like, I don't understand. And there's another thing, too. In the book, the murder takes place in the camp bathroom. And the reason why Lincoln Scott is in the bathroom at night is because there's a little nighttime bathroom inside their cabins that he doesn't use because he knows the white guys would be pissed at him. So he goes outside at night to use the bathroom, racism reasons. And when the body is found in this bathroom, Hart notices quickly that there's no blood around the body. So obviously the killing did not take place in the bathroom. The killing took place elsewhere. And he's thinking, he's like, why would you bother to move the body unless you want to hide and you don't want to draw attention to the place where the actual murder took place? And so that also tips him off that something weird is going on. And the guys who actually killed Bedford, they put on Scott's jacket and flight boots. And so there is blood on his stuff. The frame up job of him as a black man is very deliberate. And the fact that they changed that in the movie, I think, completely changes the messaging.
Why? Why are they changing all these interesting things? I don't get it.
I know. It's one of the things that was interesting while reading the book because you'd kind of pick up on that and you'd be like, oh, so something shady is afoot here. Like someone's framing him, but they're not just framing him because he's the resident black guy. Like they're framing him for a reason.
All the changes are so weird, man. I don't get it.
Yeah, for sure. They definitely took a lot of the little complexities out of the book, and there was definitely some subplots that I think you could have included and still had a nice, streamlined, easy to follow film. And I think the book too is a lot more about Tommy Hart having to not just be the lawyer, but also having to be the lead investigator effectively. Like he's trying
Yeah.
to dig up evidence. At one point, they have evidence and someone steals it from them. There's all this kind of like little back and forth that happens. He has this one German guard who he's kind of friendly with, who obviously has more information and is kind of trying to tell him, but also doesn't want to get in trouble. And so there's all these little elements that play together where you're like, how does all this fit together? And Tommy's trying to figure it out too. And then I feel like in the movie, they kind of cut right to like, he's just trying to be a lawyer and that's all.
Yeah, I guess those relationships with the guards and stuff would also make more sense if he'd been there a lot longer. If they'd left that in, but not the fact that he's been here for 2 years. That wouldn't make sense anymore, so I guess if you do the one change, you have to do the other, but at the same time, it's like, yes, but you could have left some stuff in there.
Yeah, and I mean, we'll get to it, but changing that also is why they had to change the ending of the movie. So, Visser has a little meeting with Hart, and he gives him a manual on US Army court-martial proceedings, and he's kind of having a battle of wits with McNamara. Visser knows that McNamara is planning something, but he doesn't know what, I think. And so this furthers the conflict between Visser and McNamara when Hart uses the rulebook to question the colonel's conduct during the trial.
He does not like that very much. He, like, pulls Hart outside and is like, don't you ever do that to me again.
Interesting thing I think as well is that in the book, McNamara is much less of he's not really like a main character, like he's around, but the guy that you hear a lot more from is his sidekick, this guy named Major Clark, and you can tell that McNamara and Clark are part of this nebulous escape committee that everyone's heard of, but they don't really know who's on it. But you don't really get a lot of face to face with McNamara, like he doesn't interface directly with Hart very often. So
I'll add a fictional bullet point because there's a scene where Visser goes and plays black jazz and he's like really appreciative of it. I'm like, get the fuck, get out of here. You almost feel like for a while he's on the side of this downed airman, and I don't think that he is, but the movie, if you're not well versed, I guess, in World War II and the treatment of black military personnel, so to speak, you might miss the fact that he's still a bad guy. You think he's helping the trial, and then it's such an
yeah.
interesting choice.
Well, I think I would also say that he, on some level, knows that McNamara is planning something, and so him helping the Tuskegee Airmen is more about a battle of wits with McNamara than anything else.
Maybe. Yeah, maybe. But you do have to kind of. I feel like you have to be of a certain intellect to understand that that's what's going on. I don't know if most people would see through that.
I also think that similar to the Bedford character, if you present this guy who is like to all intents and purposes a like violent racist who like is like, "Oh yeah, but I like black jazz. I have black friends." That it's like all these people who are like, have these like really it's like two things can be true at the same time. It's like you can be a virulent racist who is still like, "Yeah, well, I'll allow for jazz music." It's like people are not like all one thing or the other.
So during the trial, Scott gives an emotional address on the treatment of black pilots like himself who joined up to serve their country with honor. It's like a long speech, and I feel like Terrence Howard does a great job at this.
Yeah. There was a scene that I liked in the book where Tommy asks him to explain how he got shot down, and Scott really doesn't try and embellish at all. Like, he really doesn't want to paint himself as the hero, but Tommy kind of makes him do it because he wants these other airmen to understand the distinction with which Scott has served. And it's essentially a story where him and his wingman were returning from a patrol that they had done, and they saw a B-17 with a couple of engines down, on fire, being chased by German fighter planes. And so even though it wasn't his job, him and his wingman went down to take on these German fighters, and they both ended up being shot down. His wingman was killed, but the B-17 made it home safe. And so this is part of this whole thing where Scott basically describes how him and his fellow black fighter pilots decided that in their dedication to be the best, quote unquote, no white boys would die on our watch.
That sounds really familiar to me. I don't remember if there was in any of the other movies, maybe, or something similar at least.
Yeah, well, their loss record for the Tuskegee Airmen as an escort unit was among the lowest of all American fighter groups. The 332nd Fighter Group is one of the most decorated fighting units of the war, having received 3 distinguished unit citations. We talked about this in our Masters of the Air episode. 992 black men completed military pilot training at Tuskegee, Alabama, and Alexander Jefferson, who was in Masters of the Air, he wrote a memoir, and he explains how by the time he graduated from flight school, his class of 90 was down to 25. And this was a topic touched on by Scott in the film about how white officers would do their best to quote unquote wash out black pilots at a rate much higher than they were doing to white pilots. And this because there was a quota of how many black pilots were allowed to graduate. Yeah, and the part in the movie as well where Scott talks about how German POWs in the States had more rights than black Americans is also something that many Tuskegee Airmen observed in states where segregation was a major component of daily life. German POWs would be allowed to, for example, sit in restaurants or in the front of the cinema, whereas Black Americans were not allowed to do that. And just, Scott pointing out the unfairness of that.
I can't remember the name of the documentary, but I think we watched a documentary where it's almost word for word this that someone says, and I'll look it up, and if I remember, I'll put it on the website. But such a rough realization to be in a POW camp and being treated like absolute garbage, but then also at home being treated almost even worse than that. Like, what world is it that you then live in when you've come to do your duty to save other people, only to be just trampled by white people.
Yeah, and Scott says something that to that effect in the movie. You know, he's like, "We came to fight in this war because we thought it might earn us the right to be treated as human beings." And in the Alexander Jefferson memoir, he talked about how he was treated better in a Nazi POW camp than he was by his fellow countrymen when he got home.
At least I guess if you're being lynched, it'll be quick if you look at it like that. Like, that's the harsh reality, right? It's like, wow, that's just horrible. I just can't imagine. It's only like, it's 80 years ago. It's not that long ago. I just can't really get my mind around it.
I do super recommend the book Half American: The Epic Story of African Americans Fighting World War II at Home and Abroad by Matthew F. Delmont. I recommended that book when we did our Red Tails episode, but it bears repeating. I think that it's difficult for even those of us who are well read and open to hearing about other people's lived experiences. It's difficult for us to imagine the water of racism that Black people were forced to swim through every day in the United States in that era. And just, you know, the fact that every aspect of life was made more difficult by discrimination. And I super, super recommend reading the book because it's a real eye opener.
I will put it on the website again.
Late one night, Hart notices a fellow POW acting suspiciously and follows him to a room behind the theater where the trial is taking place. And this is a thing that also kind of annoyed me. Like, Hart keeps discovering things by accident, not because he's like a smart guy who understands things and is putting them together. But anyway, there he discovers a tunnel being dug, an escape tunnel, of course. And McNamara reveals to Hart that the trial is essentially just an elaborate distraction to hide a planned escape and an attack on a nearby ammunition plant. And McNamara confirms that Bedford did plant the spike in Archer's bunk, and he's also been sharing intel with the Germans, such as the radio location that we discussed earlier. And Bedford also planned to escape with forged German documents, likely in return for telling the Germans about McNamara's escape plan. And so McNamara caught on and killed Bedford to prevent him from blowing their plan. And this is also a change from the book where McNamara is not the killer.
Alright, I guess I needed to give Bruce Willis something to do.
No, literally.
Hart is pretty shocked because McNamara plans to go with his men on the escape, and he would sacrifice Scott to do it. And that's when McNamara reminds Hart that they are at war and that in war sometimes one man must be sacrificed to save the lives of many. And Hart is like, yeah, I get that. But also you are the ranking officer. And you should stay behind because that's your duty. And McNamara then has a go at Hart because he says he knows nothing about duty because he's only been at, like, whatever, HQ or whatever. And he also gives away that he knows that Hart has been lying about giving up information to his level 1 interrogator.
Yeah. In the book, Hart essentially figures out that in order to be allowed to escape from the camp first, these are going to be people who have performed services for the escape committee. So probably 1 and 2 out of the camp are going to be the guys who did the murder to create this distraction. Also in the book, he has this major thing with claustrophobia, which we don't see in the movie. So he basically forces himself to go down into this tunnel. It's a real struggle. And he gets all the way to the end. And the 2 guys that he meets there are Bedford's best friends who have been harassing Scott the whole time and being like, "We know you're the real killer," and like being racist and terrible. And he's like, "What? Like, you guys killed your friend?" And they were like, "Yeah, dude, he wasn't really our friend. Like, we just pretended that he was." They're like, "Listen, we'll pass along the message that Lincoln Scott is innocent, but you have to help us in the escape." And so Hart agrees to do that.
Interesting, because in the movie, everyone is just fucking racist.
Oh, yeah, I mean, everyone is this in the book, yeah.
Yeah, I guess they're also racist in the book, but at least in the book they try not to get him killed in the end, and in the movie no one cares. You're just like, let's sacrifice this man. We don't care.
Really only agree because Hart is holding an axe, and he's like, "I'm gonna delay this escape until you tell everyone that Lincoln Scott is innocent." So they're really not doing it out of the goodness of their heart.
Okay, so it's under duress, but alright. I'll take it.
On the last day of the trial, McNamara and 34 others feign food poisoning in order to be excused from the closing arguments and jury deliberation. They then slip down the escape tunnel. At this point, Hart has told Scott the situation and he's been like, "Yeah, I really think you should go with them when they escape." And Scott is like, "Yeah, but if I do that, they're going to quickly notice that I'm missing. Ergo, they're going to do a count. Ergo, they're going to notice all these other guys are missing. And like, I don't want to fuck up their escape. And I would rather these guys be able to get to freedom. Like, I'm willing to sacrifice my life for that." And so Scott proves himself to be a very honorable man. So then all these guys who are escaping, they slip down the escape tunnel. And as he's about to go down, McNamara overhears Hart's closing speech at the trial. And Hart seems to realize that the evidence is stacked against Scott. And the only way to save him is to announce that he himself killed Bedford, which again doesn't happen in the book. I think it's almost kind of like this whole vibe of everyone being like, I'll sacrifice myself. No, I'll sacrifice myself. I'm Spartacus. No, I'm Spartacus. Like it was very just like I don't know. I was starting to find it a bit overwrought at this point, especially because it's really not what happens in the book.
I kind of see I don't agree with it, but I see why they do that with Hart because they need to kind of redeem him for being a traitor to his country. Like, he needs some way to prove that he's a good man, which I think he already has just by being himself. But I see why the movie does it, but I didn't really like it that much. I really enjoyed, by the way, when Hart has a conversation with Scott about him joining the men on the escape. And he says, how far am I gonna get? I'm a black man in the German countryside. I'm like, yes, that would be slightly odd.
Well, we talked about this in our Masters of the Air episode where Alexander Jefferson even said, like, when he got into the camp, a lot of flyers actually didn't mind sharing a cabin with black men because they assumed that a black man would not be a German spy. Because they're like, well, the Germans are too racist to use black guys as infiltrators. And so, sort of counterintuitively, even though at home we would treat these guys like shit, over here we can trust them.
So, our buddy Visser, who is already irritated by Hart's attempts to point out collusion between his guards and the prisoners, which I guess would make more sense in the book, orders everyone out and announces that Hart will be shot there and then, instead of there being a jury deliberation period as there was originally supposed to be. That's when they do a head count, and they find out that 35 people are missing. Surprise. So, this is when Visser really kind of catches on to the fact that there is an escape plot, and he locates the tunnel. Now fully aware of the deception, he is very angry and he orders everybody at the trial to be shot as well. He kind of walks up to the building and he like kicks a pole somewhere and we see some dirt falling from the ceiling, and this is like akin to what we saw in The Great Escape where they're just hiding dirt in all sorts of places at that point, but there's like dirt everywhere and it's like a nice little callback to that for sure.
Yeah, we should say dirt from the tunnel, right? Like, when you dig a tunnel, you have
Yeah.
to take the dirt out and put it somewhere, and if you have a big old pile of it, it's very noticeable to the Germans.
I'm grateful you pointed it out because I did not catch on to what was going on. I saw him do it. I was like, wait, is this just from the fire? But it's like obviously from the tunnel. I didn't see it. I'm dumb. Before everybody can get shot, McNamara, who had escaped with his man, is apparently moved by Hart's selfless sacrifice, and he kind of, in his stolen German uniform, walks back into the camp, kind of looking at Visser defiantly. And he says, look, it's my responsibility. And that's when the ammunitions factory that they set out to blow up, blows up, and other people can get away. So he gets to be the good guy that the movie wants you to believe he is. I kind of would have liked it better if he just stayed away, but then how are you gonna end the movie?
Yeah, I guess in keeping with the sacrifice that Lincoln Scott has already tried to make and that Tommy Hart has then tried to make, kind of have to have McNamara have that same redemption arc, if that's the story you're trying to tell, I guess, about honor and sacrifice and integrity and whatever.
Yeah.
So Visser holds McNamara accountable at his request and personally executes him on the spot, sparing the remaining prisoners. I personally think this is fucking wild. Like, imagine you're in the closing days of World War II, the writing is on the wall. You know that at some point you're going to get picked up by the Russians and the Americans in the next couple months. And you're like, I will execute a high ranking American officer in front of all of his men.
And we know from actual history that camp commandants like that would have done anything they could have to try and get a good deal with the Americans or the Russians, just anyone. Anything to make them seem less of a shitbag, they would have taken that chance.
Yeah, and I do almost feel like if you had shot the ranking American officer in front of all his men, there would have been a riot. Like, can you imagine?
Yeah, and they all seemed just kind of mildly upset by it.
Yeah. Scott leads this group salute to McNamara's dead body, and then we get, like, a voiceover that says, "3 months later, the German army surrenders to the Allies, and the prison camp is liberated." Um, and the book ending is super different. So, as I said before, Tommy discovers the killers and he agrees to help them complete their escape in exchange for them telling everyone that Scott is innocent. And so his assistance amounts to he is outside of the wire. And anytime a guy wants to like come up through the tunnel, he has to like watch for Germans. And then as soon as the coast is clear, he like pulls on the rope so the person knows they can climb out of the tunnel. We saw something like this in The Great Escape. And he ends up in this knockdown, drag out physical fight with Visser, who figures out what he's doing. And he ends up killing Visser, but he ends up grievously wounded in the process. And there's this German guard who owes him big time for a major subplot reason from the book that does not appear in the film. And this guy helps him cover up that he killed Visser, and McNamara does not die. So yeah, very, very different.
Interesting. I feel like that would have been a much better ending. Like, I see what they're trying to do. They just want to make Bruce Willis a good guy. And also to have him make this really, like, change of heart. Oh man, I wish they'd kept the book. That's so much better. Although, how realistic is it to be in a fight with a proper Gestapo officer and survive?
Well, the thing about Visser in the book is that he only has one arm because he was shot down in his plane and he lost an arm. So he really has a grudge against American airmen. So yeah, so
Interesting.
yes, yeah. I mean, you just get more detail about all the characters, I guess. That'll be true of any book to movie adaptation. But
Yeah.
in the book, I think the author was better at handling the. I guess even if people are not overtly racist, there were many people who were perfectly willing to let Lincoln Scott die so that all of these other guys could escape. And in the movie, they really couldn't resist being like, "Oh, well, we can't have our good guys be even a little bit racist." And it's like, well, I just don't know if that's historically accurate.
I almost wish I didn't know about these changes because I did really enjoy the movie. I'm still gonna like I feel like I'm still gonna rate it pretty highly, but I kind of want to read the book now. But then you've also showed me a line from the book that's pretty strange. Do you still have it? And can you let the people know?
Yeah, I do. Okay. I should say, like, the book is better than this line makes it seem, but this line really cracked me up so much. I had to take a screenshot and share it with everybody. Oh, here it is. So this is from the fight that Tommy's having with Visser. The German tried to struggle up, but Tommy's legs wrapped around him so that they fought almost as close as lovers, but with murder, their only kiss. By and large, the book is much better written than that. That was the one line that I was like, well, that was a little jarring.
I would enjoy that just in the middle of a fight scene.
Yeah. Yeah, you know what? The nice thing about getting to read the book is that there will be a ton of stuff that was not in the movie, so it'll be like almost reading like a totally different story.
It's probably the better way around to do the movie first and then the book.
Yeah, honestly.
So we have some notes, or you do. Tell us your notes.
Yeah, so for the book, the author Katzenbach drew inspiration from the real life experiences of his father. Katzenbach is the son of Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach, who served in President Lyndon Johnson's administration in the late 1960s. And Attorney General Katzenbach was a law student and a navigator in a bomber who was shot down over the Mediterranean and became a POW during World War II, much like the main character in Katzenbach's novel. He spent time in Stalag Luft 3 and supposedly assisted with the escape that we saw presented in The Great Escape. And so the novel, in terms of the atmosphere of the prison camp, really draws heavily on these conversations that Katzenbach had with his father. And so even though this murder trial situation never happened, there are little anecdotes in the book and the movie that come from the real experiences of Katzenbach's father. And notably, as pertains to the main character's attitude toward Black Americans in the novel and the film, Attorney General Katzenbach was involved in the Johnson administration's civil rights activities. And there's actually a famous photograph of him facing off against Governor George Wallace in the schoolhouse door incident at the University of Alabama in 1963. And essentially, this was after the Supreme Court decision of Brown versus the Board of Education. The states were told that they had to desegregate schools. And in Alabama, the University of Alabama had routinely not accepted Black students. And so, in this instance, two Black students were supposed to begin their studies at the school. And State Governor George Wallace went down there to essentially create a big fuss. Like, he went and stood in the doorway and said that he was not going to allow the school to be desegregated and all this kind of stuff. And so, obviously, Katzenbach was on the other side, being like, dude, you have to get out of the door. You have to allow these students in. And so, he was part of these like civil rights activities under the Johnson administration. And I think the book underlines that Hart's war is a war against racism much more clearly than the movie does, which makes sense when you think about, the kind of lawyer and politician that the real Katzenbach was.
Yeah, I would say that the most effective example of that in the movie is actually Scott's address in the court martial, but they could have just taken it a lot further, I would say. Like, you said it before in this episode, it's more about honor as a whole than it is about racism specifically. They tried. I like that they tried. It almost makes me wonder if the reason I had not heard of this movie is because it's trying to question racism in America so much. I wonder if that's why it didn't make a big splash.
I don't know, because I would say that it doesn't really do that on any appreciable level. And I would say that at this point in my experience of watching films made by Americans about World War II, I don't really trust American filmmakers to be honest about racism.
And that's fair. I think you're right, actually. We need to rate this movie, but before we do, I would like to remind you that you can follow us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you would please write us a review on Apple Podcasts, I would like you for it. And also let us know when you do, because they're really difficult to find for some reason. You can recommend this episode to a friend.
Every time you send this episode to a friend, two men will fight almost as close as lovers, but with murder their only kiss.
We're gonna rate this movie Bruce Willis being Bruce Willis out of 10. So, however many Bruce Willises out of 10, I guess. I'll start because I've not read the book, and I'm gonna try and remind myself that I've not read the book. And if we had not done this podcast, I would have not known about the book. I'm just giving it 8 Bruce Willises. I really enjoyed this movie before knowing anything about the book. I just thought, like, it had me kind of invested right from the start. I really specifically enjoyed both Terrence Howard and Colin Farrell. I thought they were really good as actors in this movie. And I guess the only thing is that I didn't like that they made Colin Farrell this really kind of green soldier who didn't know what he was doing. Because I feel like, I don't know, it just didn't feel that convincing to me. But other than that, I really liked it. I thought it was plenty suspenseful. I thought the escape plan for me was pretty surprising. I did not really see it coming that much. I thought it was a good plot twist, and yeah, I just liked it as a suspenseful movie. I guess I don't think it's a terribly good World War II movie, but I just liked it as a court drama. How about you?
I'll give it 6.5 Bruce Willis's being Bruce Willis out of 10. I really wish this movie would have had the courage of its convictions to go all the way and actually make some kind of commentary about American racism during World War II in the way that the book attempts to. I think that would have made it less forgettable for me, but unfortunately, it kind of is just your average American war drama, in my opinion. Yeah, I think some of the changes that were made from book to movie made the movie weaker. That said, I mean, if you do watch the movie and you don't know anything about the book, you'll probably come away and be like, yeah, that was pretty solid. I enjoyed that. It was all right. There were a few pretty good actiony sequences. I particularly liked when the train is being strafed, and also a little bit later when there's a P-51 Mustang that shoots down a German fighter plane over the camp and it crashes and there's kind of this big explosion. When the ammunition factory is blowing up in the background of Bruce Willis's speech at the end, like there were some cool little moments like that. I think overall the courtroom scenes were not bad. And I did think that the speech that Terrence Howard, aka Lincoln Scott, gave about the treatment of black flyers was well written and was delivered well. I think that if I had a recommendation, I would say if you want to read a suspenseful novel, definitely check out the book.
So, whatever you do is what I'm taking from this. Whatever you do, watch the movie first and then read the book. I think that might be the best route to follow.
Yeah, or just skip the movie and read the book.
I can no longer do that, though, so I might read the book.
You should. You should give it a
I
read.
say again, last week I also said I might read the book, and then I also reminded myself that I've said it about 20 times and never done it. So, I promise I'm not bad at keeping my word, I'm just bad at reading books.
Are you reading anything, speaking of which?
Why would you do me like this? Do me dirty like this?
Sometimes you are reading something and then you're mad that I didn't ask you if you're reading something.
Well, I already gave it away now. I'm not reading anything. What are you reading, Sam?
Well, I have a copy of The Perfect Horse, The Daring U.S. Mission to Rescue the Priceless Stallions Kidnapped by the Nazis by Elizabeth Letts. So that might feature in an episode that we do soon.
Dun dun dun. Well, thank you everybody for listening to yet another episode of Rosie the Reviewer. You can find us wherever you get your podcast. You can rate us 5 stars. You can follow us on Instagram at Rosie the Reviewer Podcast. Or you can visit our website, rosieTheReviewer.com. We'll see you next week.
Bye.